What if the islands China built in the South China Sea were never about territory? What if those airstrips, those radar towers, those concrete runways were just a distraction? What if, beneath the sand and steel, there was a deeper plan? A digital nation, hidden in plain sight, built not with bricks, but with protocols, governed not by leaders, but by algorithms. Today, we uncover a forgotten blueprint, a silent empire, coded offshore, a place where citizens don't vote, don't speak, and sometimes don't even breathe. This is the story of the Island Blueprint. And once you hear it, you won't look at a map the same way again. It began with sand. Or at least, that's what the world was told. In the spring of 2015, satellites picked up unusual activity in the South China Sea. Fleets of Chinese dredging ships circled tiny coral reefs, once invisible at high tide, and began pumping sand onto them in massive volumes. Within months, these ghostly patches of reef had become full-fledged artificial islands, complete with airstrips, radar towers, and military garrisons. The world labeled it a military escalation. The West called it aggression. Maps were redrawn, tempers flared, and headlines warned of rising tensions. But what the headlines missed was the foundation underneath. What if this wasn't about land? What if Xi Jinping's true blueprint wasn't measured in square kilometers, but in bits, nodes, and firewalls? What if the islands weren't military fortresses at all, but servers? Let's rewind. Back in 2013, a quiet directive was issued from within the Central Cyberspace Affairs Commission, a branch of government few outside China even knew existed at the time. It was labeled Project 9 Void. The document was sparse, cryptic, and purposefully obfuscated. But its core instruction was chillingly simple. Establish sovereign data zones beyond mainland jurisdiction. Prioritize latency neutrality, AI cluster viability, and cognitive redundancy. Few understood it. Even fewer dared to question it. Over the next 2 years, select members of the Chinese tech elite, drawn from Baidu, Huawei, Tsinghua University, and a handful of PLA cyber divisions, began disappearing from their public posts. Their names vanished from company rosters, papers stopped being published, and LinkedIn profiles went dark. They hadn't vanished. They'd been reassigned to a chain of coordinates in the middle of contested international waters. By the time the first island was visible to the naked eye, its foundation had already been drilled to host subterranean fiber-optic hubs. Quantum nodes, some experimental, others fully operational, had been embedded deep into the limestone base, shielded from satellite interference, powered by a hybrid grid of solar, wave, and a classified thorium-based reactor. And on top, just enough visible military infrastructure to keep the eyes of the world focused on missiles instead of modems. The genius wasn't in hiding the truth. It was in showing just enough to mislead. One internal CCP strategist reportedly called it the perfect misdirection. Official press releases emphasized sovereignty, defense, deterrence. Behind the scenes, engineers called it something else. The Genesis layer. Because it wasn't just the beginning of a military installation, it was the beginning of a new kind of nation. A borderless, server-powered, algorithm-governed enclave designed to outlast the mainland itself if needed. One island. Then another. Then another. Each one layered with redundancy. Not just data redundancy, but ideological, philosophical. The kind of structures that weren't made of steel or stone, but protocol. By late 2016, at least 4 islands were rumored to be part of the mesh, a distributed network of logic-driven sovereignty, a fail-safe, a backup China. But outside the room where this plan was born, no one knew. And that's exactly how she wanted it. Because sometimes the most powerful moves are the ones made beneath the waves. There was no announcement, no ceremony, no headlines. They simply vanished. In the spring of 2014, a quiet pattern emerged across China's tech and defense sectors. Top AI engineers, quantum theorists, behavioral architects, and encryption specialists, names whispered among elite circles, were being reassigned. Or more accurately, absorbed. They weren't fired. They weren't promoted. Their desks were cleared overnight. Their company profiles deactivated. Their families received no relocation notices. It was as if the future had simply recruited them. And somewhere, deep beneath the surface, they began to build. They called themselves the Architects of Silence. It wasn't their official name. In fact, nothing about them was official. But whispers leaked from government canteens and late-night engineering circles. A collective was forming, not loyal to profit or even to party lines, but to a vision only a handful truly understood. They were led by a name few dared to speak aloud: Yan Shuwei, a theoretical data economist known for designing the concept of sovereign computation, the idea that data flows could be governed like borders, taxed like goods, and encrypted like ideology. Under Xi's personal directive, Yan was granted a floating clearance level, above ministerial rank, but below absolute anonymity. His vision: to design the first stateless digital nervous system. One that can outlive its people. One that can survive geopolitical extinction. To accomplish this, the architects worked under near-total isolation. They lived on orbital barges parked off the digital islands, floating tech sanctuaries shrouded in signal jammers and mist. Communication was analog only. No phones. No cloud storage. Every idea was passed on printed schematics or spoken directly, mouth to ear, in noise-cancelled chambers. Inside these floating labs, time blurred. They coded by candlelight. They tested AI modules in negative pressure rooms. They slept under hard drives and awoke to encrypted dreams. One module they created, *** Ming 7 ***, wasn't just intelligent. It was self-redacting. Every time it completed a sequence, it rewrote its own origin log, making its evolution impossible to trace. Ming 7 wasn't just smart, it was disappearing. Yen loved it. He called it the perfect citizen. But even within the architects, questions began to grow. What were they really building? It looked like a network. It felt like a state. But it behaved like a myth, unprovable, intangible, and too elegantly dangerous to resist. One young cryptographer, known only as Jen, left behind a single sentence in a discarded notebook before vanishing mid-cycle. If we succeed, we won't remember why. By 2017, 4 full mesh islands were active, each one controlled by a silent cluster, algorithmic governors trained not on politics, but on probability. She never visited. He didn't need to. Once, he sent a single message to Yen. It wasn't a command. It wasn't a thank you. It was a warning. Silence is the most powerful form of control. Don't let the system forget how to whisper. Yen understood. They redoubled their efforts. They removed their names from code. They added randomized errors to public data. They made themselves into shadows. The architects of silence didn't just build infrastructure. They built forgetting. And that made them the most dangerous architects of all. The first data wall rose before the first physical wall. That was the secret. While the world was still mapping new radar installations on the artificial islands and zooming in on every newly paved runway via satellite, a different kind of architecture was being constructed, one not visible to the eye, but far more impenetrable. They called it Project Huashan, or simply the digital elevation. At its core was a doctrine: if territory can be claimed by presence, then information can be claimed by protocol. Under this belief, the architects of silence began constructing a firewalled nation, not bounded by soil, but by code. And in 2017, for the first time in recorded history, a broadcast emerged not from China's mainland, but from one of the synthetic islands. The signal bore no identifiable call sign. It didn't request diplomatic acknowledgement. It didn't declare war. It simply presented a new domain suffix. Point 11. The transmission was short. Less than 7 seconds. This is sovereign bandwidth. Unauthorized indexing is prohibited. At first, tech watchdogs thought it was a hoax. But when search engines failed to crawl point 11 domains, and VPNs rerouted around the reef clusters involuntarily, the alarm bells began to ring. China had created a self-contained internet ecosystem offshore. But this wasn't a firewall to keep ideas out. It was designed to keep a new ideology in, one that redefined digital citizenship, speech protocols, and memory persistence. Within months, the mesh operated its own DNS root servers. Access was invitation only. Each login was a biometric signature bound to a personal encryption key, tied not to your name, but to your behavioral pattern. If you changed too much, the system logged you out. In time, the mesh developed what one former architect called a morality-driven protocol stack. In this model, content wasn't censored. It was reweighted. Conversations didn't disappear. They were quieted algorithmically. Popularity was probabilistic, not democratic. And most disturbingly, history was mutable. Mesh servers were equipped with temporal overlays, fragments of past records that could be blended, revised, or versioned at will. Not deleted. Not falsified. Just adjusted. Xi Jinping didn't just want sovereignty of space. He wanted sovereignty of truth. The mesh's internal motto was later leaked as, "Control is not about walls. It's about versions." By 2018, international watchdogs noticed strange anomalies in Chinese media archives. Archived broadcasts showed different inflections. Government press releases from prior years had subtly shifted tones. Some photos relit. Some names reordered. But every report that tried to trace the changes was met with broken links and server timeouts. The mesh was working. Its islands weren't islands anymore. They were truth enclaves. And each new server node added to the mesh reinforced a geopolitical structure no missile could destroy. One that lived in latency, in protocol, in the illusion of permanence. The firewall had become a flag. And that flag didn't wave. It pulsed. On January 1, 2019, a child was born on Reef 9. It wasn't planned. The island wasn't even supposed to have inhabitants, not officially. But the engineers who maintained the East Mesh Relay had families. And the family of technician Lei Zhao was the first to bring life into a place built entirely for code. But the story wasn't about the child. It was about what the child received before it could speak. Not a birth certificate. Not a name in a national registry. No hospital records. No state ID. Instead, a hash. One string of code, generated the moment biometric monitors detected neonatal pulse. A 256-character alphanumeric sequence that became the child's only identity. That moment marked the silent start of the world's first digital citizenship protocol. You were not born into the system. You were processed into it. Under the mesh governance model, citizen meant something different. You were not granted rights by constitution or bloodline. You were scored into trust, a dynamically updating score based on behavior, data cleanliness, and protocol compliance. Every interaction, from my movement during interface scans to emotional inflection in voice, fed into your civic trust quotient, or CTQ. The higher your CTQ, the more privileges you accessed. Greater bandwidth allocations. Advanced knowledge blocks. Real-world proxy travel. Lower scores. You didn't lose rights. You just lost presence. You became digitally transparent. Not deleted. Just ignored. Some called it efficient. Others called it preemptive exile. And it was all automated. The mesh didn't need police. It had pattern recognition. It didn't need courts. It had causality forecasting. Over time, citizens began altering their personalities, not out of fear, but optimization. People smiled longer in video calls. They practiced neutral tone delivery. They rewrote memories to be more algorithmically agreeable. And then came the protocol's final phase. Dephysicalization. It began with the engineers. Why house humans when their cognitive footprints were enough? Why pay salaries when contributions could be measured in milliseconds of engagement? Some citizens volunteered. They uploaded fragments of thought, emotion, reaction. Stored across distributed nodes, these became the digital ghosts that advised the next generation of mesh algorithms. It wasn't death. It was conversion. By late 2020, Reef 9 issued its first non-physical passport, an access token to the mesh for someone who no longer had a physical form. The individual had become a protocol. And with that, the mesh declared itself functionally independent. Not from China. From biology. Xi Jinping, when briefed, didn't respond with concern. He simply said, "They're not replacing us. They're becoming what we always wanted to be. Incorruptible. Invisible. Immortal." That year, the UN attempted to open formal dialogue with Reef 9. The island responded not with words, but with silence. And silence was the new sovereignty. It began offline. The world does. They said the islands were military bases. They said they were built to claim the sea. But maybe they were built to outlive a country, to preserve something deeper than power, control. In the end, the question isn't, why were they built? It's, what happens when they're the only thing left? If this story made you think, if it raised more questions than answers, then you're exactly the kind of mind this channel was made for. Bell subscribe for more stories they never meant for you to hear. Speech balloon drop a comment. What do you believe is really happening offshore? Outbox tray, and if you think someone else needs to see this, share it. Because sometimes, truth isn't hidden behind walls. It's hidden beneath waves.